The humidity in Savannah felt like a wet wool blanket, but the tension at my father's Memorial Day barbecue was heavier. I was cornered between the hydrangeas and the buffet table. My father, Joseph, and my cousin, Zachary, flanked me like I was a problem to be solved. A single sheet of legal bond slid across the linen tablecloth, right next to the potato salad. It was a waiver to dissolve the family's historic trust. They wanted to sell the carriage houses to a hotel chain for quick cash. "Just sign it, Symphony," Zachary sneered, adjusting his silk tie. "Don't make this complicated." They thought I was just the bookish archivist standing in the way of their payout. They had no idea I already owned the very table they were leaning on. Have you ever been the invisible one in your family? The one who does all the work while everyone else takes the credit? Let me know your story in the comments. To my family, I was just the quiet girl who liked old paper. They saw me covered in dust and assumed I was a relic, just like the archives I managed at the Savannah History Museum. They looked at my paint-splattered jeans and saw a lack of ambition, but they were confusing dust with equity. For 5 years, I had been living a double life. To the public, I was a mid-level museum employee, but in the ledger books of the county clerk, I was the sole restorer and manager of the Helen portfolio. 15 historic carriage houses scattered across the grid of Savannah, collectively appraised at $8.2 million. My sister, Samantha, lived her life in the glow of a ring light. She was a momfluencer, a job title that seemed to involve buying beige furniture on credit and posting long captions about the struggles of parenting while her nanny did the actual work. I remember one humid afternoon last July. I was at the carriage house on Jones Street, on my knees, covered in sawdust and sweat, refinishing the original heart pine floors by hand because power sanders would have damaged the grain. Samantha breezed in, looking immaculate in white linen. She picked up a clean hammer from a workbench, posed in front of the exposed brick I had just spent a week repointing, and snapped a selfie. She captioned it, "Renovation Life, so exhausting but worth it, #building the dream." She got 4,000 likes and a brand deal for organic juice. I got a back spasm and a historical preservation grant from the city. That moment clarified everything for me. It was the perfect illustration of the specific blindness that afflicted my family. It's called the invisible labor paradox. In a culture obsessed with the appearance of success, the actual work of maintenance is invisible. When you do your job perfectly, when the roof doesn't leak, when the foundation doesn't crack, when the history is preserved, nobody applauds, because the result is simply that things don't fall apart. Silence is the metric of my success. But for my cousin Zachary, noise was the only metric that mattered. He was the family's golden boy, a self-proclaimed tech CEO who had launched 3 startups. All 3 had failed spectacularly, burning through millions of dollars of investor money. Yet, at every Christmas dinner, my father and Aunt Lisa would hang on his every word as he talked about disruption and scaling. They saw his failures as bold risks. They saw my steady, profitable labor as quaint. They devalued me not because I was failing, but because I was fixing things quietly. They didn't understand that while Zachary was disrupting his own bank account, I was fighting zoning boards, navigating complex historical tax credits, and turning crumbling liabilities into high-yield boutique assets. So, I let them believe the lie. I let them think the carriage houses were just old buildings. Grandma Helen was too sentimental to sell. I let them think I was just playing housekeeper. It was safer that way. If they knew the portfolio was generating $58,000 a month in revenue, they wouldn't just be dismissive, they would be dangerous. To understand why I was standing there calm while they tried to bully me, you have to go back to the autumn of 2019. That was the day the family actually broke, even if nobody else heard the snap. I received a call from Grandma Helen. She didn't sound like the fragile, tea-sipping matriarch my father liked to portray her as. She sounded like a general who had just discovered a spy in the camp. She asked me to come to the main house immediately, and she told me to bring my notary seal. When I arrived, she was sitting in her sunroom, staring out at the live oaks. On the table in front of her was a baby monitor. It was turned on. "Listen," she said, her voice like crushed glass. I leaned in. The monitor was picking up audio from the kitchen. It was Samantha and Zachary. They were talking about liquidity events and luxury assisted living facilities. They weren't discussing how to care for Grandma, they were discussing how to store her. They were calculating how much the estate would be worth if they could just get the old woman out of the way and sell the portfolio before the market dipped. They called her an obstacle. I reached out to turn it off, feeling sick, but Grandma stopped my hand. "No," she said. "Let it play. I want to remember exactly what my bloodline thinks I am worth." That afternoon, we didn't drink tea, we did business. Grandma Helen had her lawyer there, a man named Mr. Sterling, who wore bow ties and had eyes like a hawk. He laid out a stack of documents that looked like a fortress wall. "They think ownership is a right," Grandma told me, looking me dead in the eye. "They think because they carry the name, they deserve the keys. But they don't understand the first thing about this land." This is where I learned the most important lesson of my life, something I call the dignity of the steward. Grandma explained that there are two kinds of owners in this world. There are the consumers, the ones who look at a historic property and see an ATM machine, a resource to be drained until it's empty. And then there are the stewards. A steward understands that true ownership isn't about the power to sell, it is about the obligation to protect. It is the quiet dignity of knowing that we are just temporary guardians of things that are meant to outlast us. A consumer asks, "What can this house give me today?" A steward asks, "How can I make sure this house is still standing in 100 years? You," Grandma said, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You are the only one who ever polished the brass door knockers without being asked. You are the only one who knows the history of the bricks. You are a steward, Symphony." We executed the documents right there on the wicker table. It was an irrevocable trust. The language was absolute. The title to all 15 properties, the land, the assets, everything was transferred from Helen to the trust, with me as the sole trustee and beneficiary. It wasn't a promise for the future. It was an immediate transfer of power. I bought the entire estate from her for $10 and a promise that she would live in her home until her last breath, untouched by the greed in her kitchen. We filed the paperwork the next morning at the county courthouse. It was public record, plain as day for anyone who cared enough to look. But my family? They never looked. They were too busy looking at themselves in the mirror. Back at the table, the humidity seemed to condense on Zachary's forehead. He tapped the waiver with a heavy Mont Blanc pen, the kind you buy to look important rather than to write anything worth reading. "Here's the play. Symphony," he said, his voice dropping into that confidential register he used when he was pitching investors on a doomed idea. "We've got an offer from the Omnilux Hotel Group. They want the entire Helen portfolio. We're talking a liquidity event in the mid-7 figures." He threw around words like liquidity event and synergy, as if they were magic spells that could turn his failures into gold. "They want to gut the interiors," he continued, not even looking at me, just staring at the horizon of his own imagined success. "Keep the facades for the historic tax credits, but turn the insides into micro-suites. It's efficient. It's scalable." I looked at Samantha. She was picking at her salad, avoiding my eyes. I knew why she was on board. Her Instagram life was expensive, the lease on her Range Rover was overdue, and her credit cards were maxed out trying to maintain the aesthetic of a successful mother. She needed this sale to clear her balance sheet. "And what about you, Zachary?" I asked, keeping my voice flat. "What do you need the money for?" "AI," he said, puffing out his chest. "I'm pivoting. The market is moving. Symphony. We need to liquidate these dusty old brick piles and put the capital into something with actual growth potential." My father, Joseph, stepped in then. He put a heavy hand on my shoulder, the way you might steady a nervous horse. "It's for the best, honey," he said. "Grandma isn't here to make decisions anymore. We need to be practical. This money, it secures the family's future." It was fascinating to watch them. They were carving up a turkey that wasn't even in the oven. They were so confident, so utterly sure that this property was theirs to sell. And that brings me to the trap of normalization. You see, my family hadn't just ignored me for 29 years. They had normalized my irrelevance. It's a psychological mechanism. If you treat someone like a piece of furniture for long enough, you stop believing they have a pulse. You stop believing they have agency. You certainly stop believing they could outsmart you. They felt comfortable selling my property right in front of my face because, in their world, I was a non-player character. I was background noise. The idea that I might have power, or ownership, or a plan, it was biologically impossible to them. They had normalized their own superiority so thoroughly that they were blind to the cliff edge they were standing on. I don't think we should sell, I said, testing the waters. Grandma wanted these preserved. Zachary laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound. Oh, symphony, that's sweet. But let's be real. You file papers for a living. You play with old dust. Leave the business strategy to the men, okay? You just need to sign the line so we can get everyone paid. He pushed the pen toward me. It rolled across the linen and stopped against my hand. Just sign the waiver, Samantha added, finally looking at me. Don't be difficult. We need this. I picked up the pen. It felt heavy. I looked at the waiver. It was a standard dissolution of interest form. If I signed it, I would be admitting that the historic trust they thought existed was valid, and I would be waiving my rights to it. But the historic trust didn't exist. It was a fiction they had invented because they never bothered to check the county records. There was only the Symphony Trust. And I wasn't waiving anything. I capped the pen and set it down. No, I said. The silence that followed my no wasn't the heavy silence of the humidity anymore. It was the sharp, brittle silence of a machine that had just jammed. Zachary chuckled, but it was a dry, hollow sound. What do you mean, no? Symphony, don't be dramatic. We've already spent the retainer on the lawyers. The deal is structured. I mean no, I said, my voice steady, because you are attempting to sell an asset you do not possess. And in the world of archives, we call that fraud. I reached down beside my chair. I didn't bring a purse to this barbecue. I brought my leather satchel, the one I used for transporting sensitive documents from the museum vault. It was heavy, worn, and smelled like old paper and authority. I placed it on the table, right on top of the linen napkins. The sound of the heavy brass clasp snapping open echoed like a gunshot in the garden. What are you doing? My father asked, his brow furrowing. Establishing provenance. I said. I pulled out the first document. It was encased in a protective mylar sleeve because I treat important history with respect. I slid it across the table toward Zachary. This is the deed of trust, I said, dated October 14th, 2019. Recorded with the Chatham County Clerk of Superior Court. Book 402, page 88. Zachary looked down. He didn't want to read it, but the bold notary stamp demanded attention. Read the grantee, I said. The Symphony Trust, he whispered. And the status? Irrevocable, he read. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pasty and sweaty in the afternoon heat. That's a forgery, Samantha snapped, looking up from her phone. Grandma would never sign that. She loved us. Grandma loved legacy, I corrected her. And she knew the difference between a steward and a parasite. I didn't stop there. I reached back into the bag. This wasn't an argument, it was an exhibit. I laid out the next document. Property tax receipts, I narrated, placing them down with a soft slap against the table. 2020 through 2023, paid in full, check the remitter. It doesn't say Helen. It says Symphony. I paid the taxes on the Jones Street house while you were leasing your Rover, Samantha. I paid the insurance on the Barnard Street property while you were bankrupting your second startup, Zachary. My father picked up the tax receipt. His hands were shaking. He looked at the numbers, then at me. For the first time in my life, he wasn't looking at his daughter, the quiet mouse. He was looking at a stranger who had outmaneuvered him for 5 years. You, he stammered. You own them? All of them? Fee simple absolute, I said. 15 properties. $8.2 million in assessed value. And 0 debt, other than the maintenance I choose to perform. I stood up. The power dynamic in the garden had inverted instantly. They were sitting, surrounded by the remnants of a meal I had paid for indirectly, trying to sell a roof I kept over their heads. You brought me here to sign a waiver for a historic trust that doesn't exist, I said, looking at Zachary. You negotiated a deal with Omnilux Hotel Group for buildings that aren't yours. You are trying to sell my property. Zachary looked like he was going to be sick. He loosened his tie, gasping for air. But I promised them. I took a deposit. Then I suggest you write them a refund check, I said coldly. Because if you try to list my buildings, I won't just sue you. I will bury you under so much paperwork you'll need a zoning permit to breathe. This was vindication. It wasn't loud. It wasn't screaming. It was the quiet, undeniable weight of the truth. I had the receipts. They had nothing but assumptions. But we're family, Samantha said. Her voice had shifted from the sharp command of an influencer to the wheedling tone of a child caught stealing candy. Symphony, look at all this value. 8 million? We can leverage that. We can partner. There is no we, I said. There is the trust. And there are trespassers. Currently, you are the latter. My father, Joseph, tried a different tactic. He put on his disappointed patriarch face, the one that usually made me crumble. Now, honey, let's be reasonable. You can't handle this alone. Zachary has business experience. He can help you manage the portfolio. I looked at Zachary. He was wiping sweat from his upper lip with a napkin, his eyes darting around the garden as if looking for an exit. Business experience, I repeated. Is that what we call it? I know the market, Zachary blustered, his voice cracking. I have connections. We can still make a deal with OmniLux. I can negotiate a better rate if you just let me. Stop, I said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command. I'm not interested in your negotiations, Zachary. I'm interested in your debts. I reached into my bag one last time. This wasn't a deed or a tax receipt. It was a document printed on heavy, menacing blue paper. I held it up so the sunlight hit the watermark. Do you recognize this? I asked him. He squinted, then recoiled as if I'd held up a snake. For those of you who don't speak finance, I addressed the table. This is a deed to secure debt. Specifically, it is a lien against the carriage house on Jones Street. $55,000. I don't know what that is, Zachary lied. You should, I said. Because you signed it. Or rather, you signed Grandma Helen's name to it. The gasps around the table were audible. My father looked at his nephew, then back at the paper. Last November, I continued. Zachary needed capital for his AI venture. He couldn't get a loan because his credit score is lower than the humidity index. So, he forged Grandma's signature and took out a high-interest private loan against the Jones Street property. He gambled that Grandma would die before the note came due. That's a lie, Zachary shouted. You can't prove that. The handwriting expert I hired can, I said coolly. But here is the twist. The private lender called the note 3 months ago. They were going to foreclose on the Jones Street house. They called me, the trustee. I didn't pay off your debt, Zachary. That would have been charity, and I don't give charity to thieves. Instead, I purchased the note. I bought the debt from the lender. I dropped the blue paper in front of him. I am the holder of the note, I said. I am the bank. You owe me $55,000, plus interest and penalties. And because I now own the debt personally, I have the right to call it immediately. Zachary looked like a man watching his life burn down in high definition. You have 30 days, I said, checking my watch as if scheduling a museum tour. If you do not wire the full amount to the trust account by June 30th, I will exercise my right to foreclose. Not on the house. I already own that. I will file a judgment against your personal assets, your car, your condo, your startup intellectual property. I will take it all. Samantha dropped her fork. My father slumped into his chair, looking aged and gray. The golden boy wasn't just a failure. He was a liability. The family structure, built on the myth of male competence and female subservience, collapsed into the potato salad. Happy Memorial Day, I said. Grandma Helen passed away 3 weeks later. She didn't fade. She simply concluded her tenure. I found her in the sunroom, sitting in her favorite wicker chair, looking out at the live oaks. She looked peaceful, like a curator who had finally finished cataloging a lifetime of artifacts and was ready to close the museum for the night. She died knowing the keys were in the right hands. That was the only eulogy that mattered. The funeral was exactly what you would expect. Samantha wore black Chanel and cried on cue for her followers, live streaming her grief. Zachary wore a suit that was too tight and looked at me with the desperate eyes of a man whose 30-day deadline was ticking down. They tried to corner me after the service, right there by the graveside. They wanted a bailout. They wanted me to forgive the debt, to release the funds, to be the quiet, compliant little sister one last time. It's what Grandma would have wanted, Samantha sobbed, clutching my arm. She believed in family. I gently removed her hand from my sleeve. Grandma believed in preservation, I said. She believed that if you let rot spread, it brings down the whole house. I didn't bail them out. I enforced the terms. Zachary lost his condo and his car. He had to move back in with his parents. A 30-year-old CEO sleeping in his childhood bedroom. Samantha had to sell her Range Rover and downsize to a rental apartment that didn't have good lighting for selfies. They called me cruel. They called me cold, but I wasn't being cruel. I was being an archivist. I was preserving the integrity of the estate. I told them the truth, the line that had been building in my chest for years. I preserve history. I don't subsidize bad fiction. I took the $55,000 I recovered from Zachary, plus the interest, and I didn't keep a cent of it. I used it to seed the Helen Grant for historic preservation. It pays the tuition for students who want to learn the trade of restoration, the dusty, unglamorous, beautiful work of saving things that others want to tear down. Tonight, I'm sitting on the porch of the Jones Street carriage house. The air is cool, and the humidity has finally broken. The gas lantern flickers against the brick I repointed with my own hands. It's quiet. There are no arguments, no demands, no influencers posing in my driveway. I used to think inheritance was about receiving something. I thought it was a gift you waited for. Now I know better. You don't inherit a legacy, you curate it. You have to actively choose what to keep and what to discard. You have to scrape away the layers of bad paint to find the solid wood underneath. I kept the buildings. I kept the history. I discarded the entitlement. And for the first time in 29 years, the silence around me doesn't feel empty. It feels like ownership. Sometimes the best way to honor your family is to protect yourself from them. If you enjoyed this story of justice, hit subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it.